Racism often hides in plain sight, but in a small southern town, that quiet truth erupted into undeniable action the morning a black woman found a noose hanging from her barn. It was meant to scare her off the land her family had worked for generations. What the gang didn't know was that Naomi Cross wasn't just a single mother. They had targeted a retired Special Forces sniper with over 2,000 confirmed kills and a war still burning in her chest. They thought she was vulnerable. They thought she was alone. But what began as intimidation would ignite a resistance, and the men who came to take her land would soon learn what happens when you mistake a soldier for a victim. Because Naomi Cross doesn't run, she defends. And this time, she's aiming to end the fight for good. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The wind moved slow through the dry Georgia fields, brushing golden stalks of hay in waves like the rhythm of a distant lullaby. Naomi Cross stood still on the edge of her porch, a mug of black coffee in one hand, her eyes fixed on the morning mist rising from the tree line that bordered her land. The house was quiet, just how she liked it. Out here, the world didn't rush. It breathed. Beyond the pasture, her livestock stirred with the dawn. A few chickens scratched the earth near the coop, and the goats bleated softly, waiting on Naomi's routine. The farmhouse, old but sturdy, bore the history of her bloodline. Black ownership passed down since her grandfather carved it out with bare hands and a rifle across his back. Naomi had grown up with calloused palms and a steady shot, shaped by land that took work, not words. Inside, Isaiah's voice floated down from upstairs as he argued with a history podcast over Bluetooth speakers. He was 16 now, lanky and curious, but with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Naomi had taught him to read a man's hands before his mouth, told him never to run unless you had cover. It wasn't paranoia. It was training and survival. By 7, they were on the road in Naomi's beat-up Ford truck, heading to the local feed store. The tires hummed against gravel, her son beside her sketching blueprints in a notebook. Dreaming of building drones one day, maybe joining the Air Force like his father once planned to. Naomi didn't speak much during drives. She let silence stretch between them like a map, marked only by the occasional nod or a low, "You good?" The feed store was quieter than usual. One of the hands barely looked up when Naomi stepped inside. Another, a red-faced man in his 50s with the name tag Trent, stiffened and cleared his throat when she approached the counter. "Y'all get that hay shipment from Madison?" she asked. He scratched his chin, avoiding her gaze. "Still stuck somewhere. Truck broke down. Might be a while." Naomi didn't answer, just watched him. Long enough for him to shift on his feet and glance at the younger clerk nearby, who gave a tight, uncomfortable smile. As she signed the invoice, she caught a glimpse of the hand-scrawled note on the wall behind the register. Locals first. Always. Back in the truck, Isaiah stared out the window. "You see how he wouldn't look at you?" he muttered. Naomi didn't turn the key just yet. "I saw. And that sign? I saw that too." They drove next to the gas station for diesel. As Naomi stepped out, a white man leaning against the ice machine lit a cigarette and stared. Not a glance. A stare that stayed. His gaze traveled from Naomi to the Black Lives Matter sticker on her back window, then to Isaiah, who was stretching beside the pump. Naomi stared back. She didn't blink. He didn't speak. Didn't have to. Naomi got back in the truck and left. As they reached the dirt road leading to the farm, a strange stillness settled over the land. The sun had lifted above the trees now, casting long shadows across the fields. Naomi slowed the truck as they pulled into the driveway. That was when she saw it. The barn door hung open, only it hadn't been left that way. She knew her locks, knew the exact pressure she used when shutting that latch the night before. She parked and told Isaiah to stay in the truck. He didn't argue. Naomi moved slow, her boots silent on the earth, a blade tucked at her lower back, another in her boot. Old habits. Inside the barn, The morning light crept through slats in the walls, painting streaks across the dust, and in the center, dangling from the rafters, was a noose. Rough rope, frayed at the edges like it had been used before. She didn't flinch, didn't move. Her eyes slid to the wall behind it, where someone had taken a knife to the old pine beams. The message was carved deep and angry, each word slashed with purpose. "Time to go, girl." Naomi didn't touch the rope. She simply stepped back into the light, her face unreadable. Then she locked the barn door behind her. Naomi said nothing as she served breakfast. She slid a plate of eggs and grits in front of Isaiah, poured his orange juice, and sat across from him with her own untouched food cooling on the ceramic. The rope hadn't moved from her mind, neither had the words, but her face remained still, her movements precise, as though routine could shield them both. Isaiah watched her from across the table, chewing slowly. "You gonna tell me what that was?" "No," she said, without lifting her eyes from the fork. "Not yet, but I saw it." "I know." He set the fork down. "What if they come back?" "They won't. Not today." "You're sure?" "I'm prepared." And she was. By noon, Naomi had swapped her boots for combat-grade ones, pulled on her utility vest, and disappeared into the old cellar beneath the farmhouse, her own secret armory left untouched since retirement. Her rifle was there, sealed in a hard case. M4, scoped, customized with a foldable stock and suppressor. She checked every part, oiled the mechanism, and then slid it back into place. A soldier's ritual, done not for show, but for readiness. But war wasn't won with bullets. Not first. She started by making calls. Old friends, retired folks. Some picked up, some didn't. The ones who did spoke low, with the kind of tired edge that meant they'd seen trouble brewing too. A former Army buddy down in Sandersville said he'd heard about 3 fires in the past month. Black farms, all ruled as accidents, with no follow-up from the sheriff's office. Naomi hung up and headed to the courthouse records office. There, behind cracked glass and rows of old filing cabinets, she sifted through property sales over the last 18 months. She wasn't an investigator by trade, but the patterns were easy to spot once you knew what you were looking for. 6 black-owned properties had changed hands in less than a year. Every sale had been processed within days of an incident, a fire, a missing person, or a report of structural damage. All were bought by shell companies, most of which linked back to one name: Forward Futures, Inc. She copied the pages with a cheap pen scanner, slipped them into her coat, and nodded a silent goodbye to the clerk behind the glass, who offered no smile. Just a glance at the scanner in her hand, and then back down to his desk. Next, she drove to the edge of Ridge Hollow, one of the few remaining black communities left standing. The sign leading into town had been shot up years ago, the paint chipped and letters barely legible. She parked outside the Wilkins place, an old couple who'd known her father when he was still plowing this land by hand. But the house was empty. The porch steps had caved in. The windows were boarded. A yellow eviction notice clung to the front door like a dried-out scab. Naomi tore it down and stepped back. No tire tracks, no footprints, no dogs barking. It wasn't just deserted. It had been erased. She drove back with a quiet weight in her chest. Isaiah was waiting on the porch when she returned, backpack slung over one shoulder and his phone in his hand. "Where'd you go?" he asked. "Everywhere," she answered. "You found something?" She nodded. "Too many things." He followed her inside, his voice low. "You're not gonna tell me again, are you?" Naomi paused, then turned to him. "I need you safe. That's all." He didn't argue, just nodded. But that night, Naomi couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the map laid out in front of her, red markers circling each address that had burned, each farm that had sold under pressure. She'd drawn lines between the incidents, tracing a pattern that spread like infection. She clicked on the sheriff's website, half expecting a dead link. But there it was. Sheriff Briggs, old and gray and smiling too wide. He hadn't returned her call. She hadn't expected him to. Naomi clicked through local news archives, reading every headline from the past year. Most were buried deep behind clickbait stories about rising gas prices and seasonal festivals. But if you knew what to look for, if you read the silences between lines, there was a pattern. Dispute ends in fire. Missing family presumed relocated. Property damage halts harvest. Language bent just enough to hide the truth. She made a list of names, not just of victims, but of neighbors who'd stayed quiet, of companies who'd bought land for suspiciously low prices, of families who left without packing trucks. Something was moving through this county like smoke, choking out black roots 1 acre at a time. By morning, Naomi walked her property line in silence, boots crunching through frosted grass. She ran her hand along the fence posts. Someone had cut one of the wires near the west boundary. Clean, fast, surgical. She looked out over the trees, her mind already calculating. If they came again, they'd try from the blind spot near the creek, where the slope dipped low enough for cover. That's where she'd start fortifying. And if they wanted her gone, they'd learn she wasn't going anywhere. Naomi stopped under the rising sun and pulled her scarf tighter around her neck. Her land stretched wide before her, untouched for now, but surrounded by the kind of silence that felt too deep to be natural. The church stood tucked behind a wall of old pine trees at the end of a narrow, unpaved lane, its white paint weathered by decades of sun and silence. Naomi hadn't stepped foot inside the sanctuary since Isaiah's baptism nearly a decade ago, and even then she hadn't lingered. But this wasn't a return for redemption or fellowship. This was reconnaissance. She opened the creaking door and stepped into the cool hush of the building, the wooden floor groaning faintly beneath her boots as stained glass light spilled in delicate patterns across the empty pews. At the far end of the room, standing beneath the faded mural of a shepherd cradling his flock, was Marcus Bell. He was still tall, still lean, though the edges of his beard had surrendered to gray. He was polishing the organ pipes with the same deliberate care he once used to field strip an M249 in the desert heat. His shoulders tensed slightly at the sound of the door, but he didn't look back. He knew who it was. "I heard about the Wilkins place," Naomi said quietly, her voice low enough to blend into the silence between them. Marcus didn't stop working, his hand continuing its slow rhythm. "You didn't hear all of it. It burned. Oh, it burned all right. But they weren't in it when it did." Naomi took another few steps forward, the weight of the news catching her in the chest, before it settled in her gut. They left 2 nights earlier, packed up, took the old Dodge, and disappeared. Said someone came around flashing money and papers, offering to buy their land outright. They didn't even clean out the house. Was it forward futures? Marcus finally turned, wiping his hands on a towel as he faced her. Name was different on the offer, but the bank trails familiar. Quiet company. Fancy website. No people listed. I checked. Naomi nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as the familiar pieces began falling into place with sharper edges. "Folks think you're back in the fight," Marcus said, studying her. "I didn't leave," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "I just stopped chasing shadows. And now they've stepped out into the light." He leaned against the edge of the pulpit, crossing his arms. "What are you really here for, Naomi? I need to know if you remember who you were before all this." "You mean before I started preaching about peace and forgiveness?" "I mean before you laid down your rifle." For a moment, he didn't say anything, and the silence inside the church felt heavier than stone. Finally, he looked at her, eyes sharp beneath the calm. "I remember. That night, just after sundown, the smell of smoke reached her before the calls did. Naomi was in the middle of reloading ammunition when the wind shifted, thick with the scent of burning wood and something far darker. She stepped onto the porch and stared westward, where an orange glow was rising over the treetops like a second sun. She didn't wait to confirm. She grabbed her rifle, signaled to Isaiah with 2 fingers, and within seconds they were in the truck and rolling fast down the gravel road, headlights bouncing with each jolt of the earth beneath them. The Turner farm sat on the edge of the county line, Nestled beside a creek bed and surrounded by fencing Reggie Turner had built himself over 10 years. Naomi could see the flames long before she reached the property. Bright tongues of fire swallowing the barn, the chicken coops, and licking at the edge of the main house with a rage that seemed almost personal. Smoke curled into the sky in thick ribbons, and the only sound louder than the roaring blaze was the faint, ragged sobbing from the roadside. Evelyn Turner was on her knees in the dirt, her hands caked with ash as she rocked back and forth beside a still, scorched figure lying face down near the fence. Reggie. His shirt was burned through in patches, his boots blackened, one hand stretched outward as if he'd been reaching for something. Perhaps a tool, perhaps her. Naomi approached slowly, her eyes scanning the tree line, the gravel drive, and the road behind her for signs of movement. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, and no casings. It was surgical, precise, designed to leave nothing but loss behind. No one had come to help. No fire trucks, no deputies, just a handful of silent neighbors standing at a distance, arms folded, mouths shut, and eyes full of things they would never say. Later that night, after the fire had devoured everything and the authorities had done little more than make a brief note and drive away, Naomi sat in her kitchen, staring at the red ink circles drawn across the county map. The pattern wasn't just coincidence anymore. It was a coordinated, spreading operation, wiping out black-owned land piece by piece under cover of night and silence. There was no doubt in her mind. This wasn't hate acting alone. It was strategy. By dawn, Marcus stood on her front porch with his sleeves rolled up and the quiet fury of a man who'd prayed long enough and was ready to act. "I've got 5 who'll stand with us. 4 ex-service, 1 still active in the reserves. They're watching the town now." Naomi stepped aside to let him in, nodding to Isaiah, who was seated on the living room floor cleaning the components of an old sidearm with care far beyond his years. Marcus paused when he saw him, eyebrows rising slightly. "He's good," Naomi said simply. Isaiah didn't look up. "She's not teaching me to shoot. She's teaching me to defend." Marcus nodded once, his voice low. "That's the only kind of fight worth learning." They spent the afternoon mapping a defense. Naomi laid out watch shifts, signal flares, fallback routes, and supply caches. Marcus agreed to use his church as a communication post. Naomi reconfigured her fields, replacing fence posts with hidden motion sensors, and planting silent perimeter alarms in the brush. She taught Isaiah how to move undetected in the dark, how to fall without making a sound, and how to breathe when your enemy couldn't. The first brick came through the window that evening, wrapped in barbed wire, tied with a strip of bloodied cloth, and soaked in kerosene. Naomi picked it up from the floor as Isaiah stood frozen behind her. She didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't hesitate. She carried it to the kitchen sink, lit a match, and held it over the flames until every thread was ash. "They think we're scared," she said, her voice low and steady. "They don't understand what fear really looks like." The next morning, the sun rose over Naomi's land in sharp slants of gold and silver, cutting through the thin fog that hovered along the edges of the fields like breath from something waiting to exhale. Naomi stood in the barn's loft, binoculars steady in her hands, watching the tree line to the west, with the patience of a predator who never forgot how to stalk. The air was still, but not calm. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every creak of old wood carried weight. By now, she trusted her instincts more than the quiet. She had gone back through her notes, her maps, her records, and finally dug up a name that struck a different kind of alarm bell. It wasn't listed on the land deeds, but buried within a folded flyer from a so-called local values rally held 2 towns over, an event the news barely covered, and the locals pretended didn't happen. His name was printed near the bottom in small, bold letters. Clayton Ward, a former paramilitary contractor turned land consultant. Clayton was known in a few far corners of the country, just enough for whispers but not enough for charges. Photos showed him leading tactical survival groups, speaking at militia meetings, shaking hands with known extremists. Naomi dug deeper. The shell companies tied to Forward Futures had listed his firm as a third-party assessor. He wasn't just involved. He was organizing. She took her findings to Sheriff Leonard Briggs that afternoon. His office smelled like burnt coffee and dust, the kind of place where problems were more likely to be filed away than solved. He looked over her printed documents without touching them, his jaw twitching once as his eyes skimmed the name at the top. "I know that name," he said, setting the paper down slowly. "I figured you would," Naomi replied, her voice level. He leaned back in his chair, a groan of old springs breaking the silence. "Look, Naomi, this town's had its problems, but I don't think we're looking at something that deep. Land disputes get messy. Tempers flare. That doesn't mean there's a war party moving in. A man is dead. Farms are burning. Families are vanishing overnight. If that's not a war party, you'd better redefine your terms." Briggs looked away, staring out the window for a long moment, as though the dusty parking lot outside held answers he couldn't find in the room. "Even if what you're saying has weight, we don't have the manpower to start poking nests we can't crush." Naomi stood. "Then don't get in my way. That's all I'm asking." Briggs didn't respond. He just reached for his coffee and took a long, quiet sip. Back at the farm, Naomi stopped asking for help. She started preparing for siege. It began with the land itself. She walked the perimeter every day, planting tripwires low in the grass, reinforcing fencing with barbed wire strung tight like a taut violin string. Every post she touched was measured and marked. By dusk, she'd mapped out 4 blind spots and filled them with motion sensors scavenged from broken cameras and old hunting equipment. Isaiah helped, following her instructions without question. He didn't ask what each device did. He didn't have to. He was learning more from her silence than any lecture could offer. They trained together at dawn and again at night. Naomi showed him how to breathe through his nose and hold the air in his chest without trembling. She corrected the angle of his shoulder, adjusted the weight of his grip, and taught him how to listen, not just for movement, but for what was missing. They used tin cans at first, then fruit, then moving targets made from old scarecrows strung on lines that glided between trees. Isaiah missed more than he hit in the beginning, but his frustration never cracked into complaint. Naomi could see something hardening behind his eyes, not fear, but understanding. He was no longer trying to be brave. He was becoming ready. Marcus returned 2 days later, and this time he didn't bring words. He brought people. They met in the barn, a place once used for hay and harvest, now reimagined as a training ground. Naomi laid out her gear on a plywood table. Rifles, handguns, maps, satellite images printed in black and white. The 5 men and women who followed Marcus into the room were all older, all quiet, and all carried themselves like people who had once walked through fire and lived to teach others how to avoid the burn. "We've got limited ammo and even less time," Naomi began, her tone calm but unwavering. "This isn't about attack. It's about survival. If we stand together, we hold them. If we scatter, they'll pick us off one at a time." One of the men, short and built like a brick wall, nodded. "You the one they call Crossfire back in the day?" Naomi didn't answer directly. "I hit what I aim at." That was enough. Training began before dawn and continued past sundown. They learned the land, moved through fields like shadows, and dug trenches that could double as foxholes. Marcus taught them silent communication, using hand signals and eye contact, a language he hadn't spoken since Baghdad. The group moved like memory, slow at first, then more confident, then seamless. Neighbors who had never spoken now passed weapons to one another without hesitation. They practiced ambush drills, first aid, and fallback procedures. There were no uniforms, no ranks, just resolve and shared purpose. At night, Naomi kept watch from the roof. The stars above her spun in silence, indifferent to the war forming on the ground below. She didn't sleep much, didn't need to. Sleep was a luxury. Readiness was not. One evening, as she surveyed the north side, Isaiah joined her. A blanket draped over his shoulders and a thermos in hand. He sat beside her without speaking, the way he always did when words would only get in the way. After a while, he glanced up at her, voice soft. "Do you think they're watching us right now?" Naomi kept her gaze fixed through the scope. "I hope so." "Why?" "Because it means they're nervous." She didn't say what she really meant. That she hoped they saw every trap, every armed neighbor, every quiet patrol, because fear, once planted, could bloom just as powerfully as courage. And Naomi intended to sow both. The wind began to shift around dusk, and though it came low and soft like an afterthought, there was something about the way it moved that sent a message Naomi could feel through the soles of her boots. It rolled through the treetops like a warning, subtle but insistent, pressing through the landscape and carrying a heaviness in its current that settled along her shoulders as she walked the outer perimeter of the property. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, scanned the eastern ridge without pause, trained by years in terrain far less forgiving and far more deceptive. But tonight, she didn't need military instinct to know that something wasn't right. The land itself was speaking. The air held a new density, one that clung to her skin and made each breath feel just a touch slower, a little more deliberate. The goats, usually docile by this hour, paced the fence with unease, bumping into one another without making their usual calls. The barn cat, notorious for prowling even in stormy weather, hadn't moved from the rafters all afternoon, its green eyes wide and unblinking. And even the crows, the loud-mouthed heralds of dusk that normally congregated along the tree line, had gone silent, leaving the edge of the woods still and empty. Naomi didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her years in the field had taught her that nature never lied. When it turned quiet, something was always approaching. So, without altering her pace, she subtly adjusted the pressure in her step, dropped her center of gravity just slightly to blend with the terrain, and continued forward with the soundless caution of someone who had walked into hostile territory more times than she could count. In the distance, Isaiah was working with Marcus along the northern edge of the cornfield. The two of them had been stacking sandbags in quiet coordination, reinforcing a low protective wall near the old irrigation trench. Marcus, always aware, caught Naomi's signal instantly, a flat palm followed by a precise tilt of her chin. Isaiah, still learning, hesitated for just a breath longer. It was a signal he hadn't seen before, but his mother's expression carried no uncertainty. He dropped the bag in his hands and followed without asking. Inside the barn, the group she had trained over the past 2 weeks gathered with speed and silence. These were people who once might have doubted their place in a fight, but no longer questioned their reason for standing in one. Each of them entered without wasted motion, their weapons strapped tight, their breath even, and their movements crisp. Maggie arrived moments later, the first aid pack already over her shoulder, her footsteps purposeful, her eyes alert beneath the silver halo of her curls. "They're coming," Naomi said, the words low and deliberate, each one cutting through the quiet, like a knife unsheathed. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his jaw tight as he responded. "How soon?" Naomi didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the monitor displaying the live feed from their makeshift infrared cameras. The grainy black-and-white screen showed faint blurs, soft pulses of heat that weren't there an hour ago. "They're not rushing it," she murmured. "They're watching how we move, testing the edges, poking at the fence, trying to find the weak spot." "They're probing," muttered one of the older men in the group, his shoulders squared and jaw clenched. "Standard recon. Small groups, slow rotation, checking response time. They'll wait until it's completely dark," Naomi continued, her voice measured and certain. "They want us tired before they make their move. They want to break us with the silence before they even shoot." Isaiah looked toward the door, his voice steady but edged with tension. "So, what do we do?" Naomi didn't blink. "We wait in the dark, too." What followed was smooth and practiced. Naomi moved quickly, assigning posts with a calm authority that didn't leave room for second-guessing. She adjusted the radio frequencies, double-checked fallback routes, and gave final clearance on each patrol sector. Every person rotated into place like they had rehearsed it for months, rather than days. By the time the last beam of sunlight dipped behind the horizon, Naomi had already climbed to the barn's upper loft, her rifle slung tight against her back, and her eyes fixed through the mounted scope as the shadows deepened across the field below. For nearly 2 hours, there was nothing, no movement, no sound. The trees barely rustled, the wind cooled to a whisper, and the woods, once full of night calls and distant shuffling, had gone unnaturally still. Then, just as Naomi exhaled slow and steady into the eyepiece, the silence broke. Not with a shout or the sudden crack of gunfire, but with something much smaller. A click, deliberate, metallic, and barely audible. The kind of sound made by someone unfamiliar with the ground they were crawling on. The kind of mistake that cost lives in her world. Naomi shifted the scope without hesitation, drawing her focus toward the southeast quadrant. Between 2 trees, 50 yards out, a shimmer caught the light. Just the faintest glint of something metal catching a piece of moonlight. Then the subtle shape of a figure took form, crouched low, finger raised slowly in what could only be a signal. She didn't fire, not yet. Another figure moved in the tall grass just beyond the cornfield, crawling low to avoid the camera's thermal range. A third figure emerged near the broken stone wall, and just behind him, a fourth. This one, stationary, rifle drawn, his posture unmistakable. They were encircling the property. Her comms hissed softly in her ear as Marcus's voice came through. "East side. 2 confirmed. Waiting on your word." "Hold!" Naomi whispered, eyes never leaving the scope. Her hand shifted to the secondary dial, widening the field of view. Across the ridge, deeper in the tree line, another figure appeared, motionless, scanning. A spotter, the kind used in coordinated assaults to count positions and relay information before the assault team moved in. This wasn't harassment. This was a formation. And then it began. A single crack pierced the stillness, sharp and unmistakable. A bullet ripped through the air, hitting the outer fence with a spray of splinters and dust. Naomi's finger closed around the trigger, her breath even. The first round left the barrel in a suppressed whisper and struck the man near the cornfield directly in the chest. The second came less than a second later, dropping the crawler just behind him. Their advance faltered. Then the air erupted. Gunfire exploded across the night, violent and unrelenting. Muzzle flashes lit up the trees in chaotic bursts as bullets shredded into the earth, chewing through the fencing and sending shards of wood and wire flying through the smoke. The attackers didn't charge with reckless noise. They advanced in practiced bursts, covering ground in coordinated steps, communicating with flashes and hand signals. But Naomi's people didn't panic. Marcus responded instantly, issuing instructions through the comms as he returned fire from the western ridge. The others held position along the reinforced grain silo and the dugout near the root cellar, using the terrain just as they had been trained. Each shot was measured, every movement calculated. This wasn't their first night watching a storm roll in, but they hadn't expected the size of it. Isaiah braced behind the planter box, his hands steady around his rifle as he tried to find a line through the smoke. Naomi spotted him from her vantage point and didn't waste time. "Isaiah," she said into the comms. "Shift left." He moved instantly. A split second later, a round slammed into the planter where his chest had been, blowing apart wood and soil. He dove behind the well, his breathing sharp but controlled, the hesitation burned out of him by the closeness of death. Then, from the far east side, a scream pierced the chaos. Naomi swiveled her scope and found Paul, one of Marcus's crew, falling to his knees near the edge of the cornfield, blood pouring from his side. Maggie was already running toward him, ducking low, moving fast, her pack swinging as she slid behind a rock wall to reach him. These weren't amateurs. They moved in synchronized waves, using smoke canisters to obscure vision and burst flashlights to disrupt aim. Naomi recalibrated quickly and resumed firing, striking targets with efficient precision, but for every two she hit, another stepped forward, moving through the smoke like a second wave rising to consume the first. This wasn't some message. It was removal. Naomi switched channels. "Marcus, this isn't intimidation. They're trying to take the land tonight." "I know," he answered. "We hold until dawn. They'll break the fence in 10. "I'll lock the south," Marcus replied. "Get to Isaiah." Without another word, Naomi climbed down from her post, rifle across her back, handgun drawn, and sprinted across the field with the speed of someone who had long ago stopped fearing gunfire. She dropped behind the porch just as another round slammed into the wall near her son's head. "You good?" she asked as she crouched beside him. Isaiah, cheeks flushed and eyes blazing, nodded hard. "I'm better now." "Stay low," Naomi said as she chambered another round. "We push them back from here." Side by side, mother and son rose with the rhythm of the firefight. And as the night deepened, so did the battle. The night had broken wide open, not with screams or sirens, but with the brutal rhythm of war, measured, exact, and unnervingly calculated. The gunfire had shifted in tempo now, less a chaotic barrage and more a patterned advance. Naomi could hear it in the spacing between shots, the careful pauses, the way the assailants moved between angles as if sweeping a perimeter they already knew. This wasn't rage, it was orchestration. Behind the thick planter wall, Naomi crouched beside Isaiah, her eyes scanning the line of trees just beyond the eastern fence. The moonlight fractured across the smoke, revealing shapes only long enough to invite suspicion. She raised her rifle and waited. Not for noise, not for movement, but for a mistake. It came less than a second later. A muzzle flashed briefly between two trees, and Naomi reacted with the instinct of someone who had not only trained to kill, but had perfected it into art. Her breath slowed, her hands didn't tremble, and her body became still as stone. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the shot whispered through the air before the man on the ridge even knew he'd been seen. He collapsed backward into the dark without a sound, his silhouette folding into the earth. Naomi didn't wait to confirm. She was already adjusting her scope, sweeping to the right where two more figures were trying to flank from the side. Their movements were tight and quick, trained, but not refined enough to hide from someone who had survived jungle hunts in Colombia and rooftop kills in Aleppo. Her next two rounds landed clean, sending both men tumbling into the grass before they could reach cover. Beside her, Isaiah exhaled sharply. That was 3 in under 4 seconds. Naomi didn't look away from the scope. Too slow. She rotated her body slightly and pulled him closer to the stone well. Cover the gap by the second tree. 2 more are moving low. Wait for both before you fire. Never reveal position too early. Isaiah nodded, swallowing his nerves as he raised his rifle and mimicked her posture. To the south, the sound of return fire thickened. Marcus's voice came through the comms, gruff and controlled. Heavy push from the lower ridge. They've got body armor, trying to collapse the outer fence. Naomi glanced at her watch, reading the timeline she had calculated hours earlier. We've got 6 minutes before they break the gate. You need to pull the fallback team to the secondary trench. Already moving, Marcus responded. But we've got a problem. One of them has thermal. They've got our layout. Naomi's jaw tightened as her fingers moved to the channel dial. Give me 10 seconds. I'll remove the reader. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She moved like breath across the porch, low and controlled, cutting across the open gap without hesitation. Smoke coiled around her legs, swallowing sound, and when she reached the edge of the tool shed, she dropped flat to her stomach and crawled beneath the collapsed frame of an old plow. She could see him now, stationed on a rise just above the southern trench, his helmet lit with an infrared glow. a device strapped to his eye like he was playing war instead of fighting one. He didn't hear the shot. Naomi fired once, and the infrared light flickered before the man slumped sideways, with his scanner still buzzing faintly against his temple. She moved again before his body had finished falling, slipping between rows of fencing toward the trench where Marcus and his men were digging in. One of the veterans, a tall woman with braids tied tightly beneath a cloth band, tossed Naomi an extra magazine without a word. Another, half covered in dirt and blood, nodded once and returned to firing across the south end. "You good?" Marcus asked, crouched beside her behind an overturned water trough. "Better than them," she muttered, taking in the layout. The field was torn now, scattered with broken fencing, spent shells, and the bodies of men who thought they were hunting. She recognized the signs of slipping morale. The attackers were starting to move less like a unit, and more like individuals caught in the pull of chaos. They hadn't expected this much resistance, they hadn't expected precision, and they definitely hadn't expected her. A shout cracked through the woods, ragged, desperate. Someone was calling for cover as they tried to drag one of their own out of the mud. Naomi ignored it. She zeroed in on the runner, a tall man with a vest that marked him as field ops, likely second in command. She traced his path across the terrain and fired once, the round slicing through the fabric just beneath his arm and punching through his chest. He dropped mid-step, his comrade scrambling backward without even attempting a return shot. Just then, a scream erupted from the west trench, raw and panicked. Naomi's heart snapped toward the sound before her body did. Through her scope she saw Clarence, the oldest of their neighbors, who had refused to leave his land even when his family begged him to go, lying on his side, clutching his leg. Blood was pouring through his fingers, and his rifle had slid several feet away into the dirt. The wound looked high, femoral. Maggie was already sprinting, ducking beneath gunfire with the med kit slung across her shoulder and no hesitation in her stride. But then came the moment Naomi would remember, long after the smoke cleared. Isaiah. He was near the eastern post, shifting positions just as they'd practiced, when one of the attackers came up the ridge earlier than expected. The man moved fast, too fast for Naomi to call out in time. He aimed directly at Isaiah, his barrel catching moonlight as he crept along the fence's shadow. Naomi's breath stopped. She turned, fired. The bullet hit the attacker in the side of the neck before he could squeeze the trigger. He fell backwards with a shocked gurgle, crashing into the underbrush. Isaiah dropped flat instinctively, eyes wide, chest heaving as he rolled toward Naomi's position and crawled behind the stacked stone wall. "I didn't see him," he gasped, still gripping his rifle. "You're still breathing," she said softly, brushing the dirt off his arm. "That's what matters." She rose slowly and returned to her vantage, resetting her scope with deliberate precision. The battle was shifting. She could feel it in the tremble of the gunfire, in the rhythm of the retreat. Their lines were breaking. The resistance had held. Naomi switched her comms again. "They're losing momentum. We press while they're confused." Marcus's voice was steadier than ever. "You lead the north. I'll sweep the trench." Naomi climbed to the roof again, her body moving fluidly despite the bruises already blooming beneath her gear. From above, she watched the field breathe, no longer in attack, but in desperation. The enemy lines had scattered, their formation shattered. Every trap Naomi had built with her hands and her memory had worked. Smoke bombs had herded their movement. Ditches had broken their runs, and precision had dismantled their command. One last figure ran toward the ridge, tall, desperate, the kind who knew he'd failed. Naomi steadied her breath, sighted in, fired. He dropped before he reached the trees. The woods beyond held no more movement. The land was still. Below, Isaiah stood again. His chest rose and fell with adrenaline, but his hands didn't shake. He looked at Naomi with something deeper than fear, something that understood what it meant to live through something you could never explain. Naomi looked out across her field, now scorched and stained, but still hers. And as the first whispers of dawn crept over the ridge, she knew the message had been sent. They could come with fire. They could come with numbers. But they would never take her land, not while she breathed. The smoke hadn't yet cleared from Naomi's fields before the next wave began to build. She could feel it in the air, heavier now, not with the tremble of uncertain attackers, but with the sure-footed movements of men preparing for war. The first assault had tested their defenses. The second was meant to break them. And it was no longer just about the farm. The call came in just after sunrise, the radio hissing with urgency as Marcus's voice came through from the church tower. They're moving through the ridge, flanking west, and splitting into 2 columns. This isn't a raid. They're coming for the whole town. Naomi didn't blink. She slid her rifle across her shoulder, checked the pistol holstered at her side, and called into the open barn where the rest of her team was tending to the wounded and resetting gear. "We've got less than 15 minutes before they breach," she said firmly. "They're not here to scare us anymore. They're here to erase us." Isaiah, who had barely slept since the ambush, stood from where he'd been coiling wire near the radio post. "They're hitting Ridge Hollow? They're not just coming for land this time. They're coming for the people still standing on it." Marcus confirmed it in the next breath. "Church perimeter is hot. Roads are being blocked. They've got military-grade jammers running. No cell signals. No 911. We're alone." Naomi's eyes narrowed. She'd expected a follow-up strike, but not with this level of coordination. Whoever was backing this gang wasn't just throwing bodies into the dirt. They were financing a movement and planning to make an example of every person who refused to fold. She moved to the map spread across the workbench and drew a red line through the town's western edge. "We hold 3 lines. Here, here, and here. Grain Tower, Market Square, and the roadblock near Holloway's place. They'll funnel in from the east and try to press through town like a wedge. We split them before they consolidate." Her voice was steady, but her mind was already moving ahead. She'd fought in cities, in villages, across mountaintops and through desert valleys, but nothing burned deeper than the knowledge that this time she wasn't fighting for a flag or a mission. She was fighting for home. By the time they reached the edge of town, her team had already split and moved into position. Naomi took the church rooftop, where Marcus had repurposed the old bell tower into a sniper's nest. From that vantage, she had full view of the road, the square, and the tree line beyond. The attackers weren't subtle this time. 2 blacked-out trucks rumbled toward the main road, engine blocks reinforced with armor, grills lined with steel rails meant for breaching. At least a dozen men rode in the flatbeds, their weapons raised and scanning, their heads covered with masks or helmets. Naomi exhaled once and took the first shot. The round slammed into the front axle of the lead vehicle, and the truck dipped violently to the right, tires shredding as it skidded into a ditch. Before the second driver could react, Naomi fired again, this time striking the engine housing, sending steam erupting through the grill as the vehicle hissed and bucked to a halt. Chaos followed. Gunmen leapt from the back, shouting commands and returning fire toward the rooftops. But Naomi had already repositioned, her scope trained now on the radio pack strapped to the back of the man barking orders. She fired once, just beneath the antenna mount, and the signal pack sparked and died. Their comms were gone. Their coordination would soon follow. Down on the street, Marcus's team emerged from alleyways and dug-in corners, unleashing a flanking maneuver that trapped the gang between the burned-out diner and the barricaded schoolhouse. Gunfire erupted across the square, and windows shattered as rounds punched through storefronts. Isaiah moved with practiced speed, ducking behind an old delivery truck and signaling 2 teenagers who had been posted behind the old feed supply store. They moved like they had rehearsed it a dozen times, falling into positions and covering each other with surprising clarity. Then, just as Naomi reset her scope to track the second column circling through Holloway's lane, the radio cracked again. this time with Isaiah's voice, breathless and tight. "I'm hit. I mean, not hit, but pinned down, southwest corner, by the big oak tree. They've got a clear angle." Naomi's heart dropped into a cold, focused silence. She swept her rifle that direction, saw him crouched low behind a tipped garden wagon, the flash of rifle barrels trained on his position from the tree line just beyond. She moved to shoot, but before she could fire, a second figure blurred across her scope. It was Maggie. The older woman sprinted out of her front door with the kind of speed and fluidity that had nothing to do with panic. She moved low and fast, her gray curls tied back beneath a faded medic band, her arms pumping as she dashed toward Isaiah's position. Naomi watched as Maggie dropped beside him and pulled him behind the base of the oak, her body shielding his without hesitation. One of the attackers opened fire from the woods, and Naomi fired back with a shot that shattered his shoulder, sending him spinning into the underbrush. When the firefight eased enough for Naomi to reposition and rejoin them on foot, Maggie was crouched with Isaiah, pressing a bandage against a cut above his eye. "Where the hell did you learn to move like that?" Naomi asked, crouching beside her. Maggie didn't look up. She was too busy wrapping gauze with practiced efficiency. "Kuwait. Before that, Fallujah. I was a trauma medic with the 28th. Spent 6 months with Delta units out of Bagram." Naomi stared at her. "You never said a word." Maggie shrugged slightly. "Didn't think you'd need me. Until now." Isaiah looked between them. Blood streaked across his cheek, but eyes wide with something beyond pain, recognition. "You knew my dad," he whispered. Maggie nodded gently. "I did. Saved him once, in a compound west of Kandahar. He used to talk about this sharp-shooting medic he fell in love with." Naomi's breath caught. Maggie turned to her, her voice steady. "He said you were colder than ice, and twice as deadly." He was right. Naomi didn't speak for a long moment. Then she reached out and clasped Maggie's arm. "Welcome to the fight." And from that point forward, Maggie Holloway wasn't just a neighbor. She was resistance. The firefight tapered off just before noon, but the silence it left in its place was not peace. It was the kind of quiet that hummed with unfinished violence, a silence stitched together by smoke and dust, by the weight of boot prints pressed into the bloodied roads. Naomi moved through the rubble of the town square with her rifle still drawn, her eyes scanning every shattered window and shadowed alleyway, listening for the breath of someone who hadn't run far enough. They had held the town, but the cost was written on the bodies of those they couldn't save, and in the eyes of those who had survived. Beside the overturned water truck, Naomi found the man who had led the second assault. He was still breathing when she dropped to one knee beside him, though just barely. The blood pooled beneath his ribs was spreading slowly, soaking the torn patches on his tactical vest. His hand twitched near the grip of a pistol, but Naomi put her boot over his wrist and leaned her full weight forward. "Who's backing this?" she asked, her voice even and low, her tone not meant for threats or mercy, only truth. He didn't answer, just smiled faintly, red bubbling at the corner of his mouth, eyes glazed with something too broken to be called defiance. She reached into his chest rig and pulled free a folded sheet of laminated paper tucked behind a false lining. At first glance, it looked like a terrain map, but the red markings weren't troop paths. They were property lines. She unfolded it slowly, studying the gridwork of names and plots. Black-owned land, hundreds of acres, labeled, numbered. Not just her county, not just Ridge Hollow, 3 counties, dozens of family farms, and each one was marked with a red X. She felt the cold rise from her spine, not fear, but recognition. This wasn't about ideology alone. This was a land war. A hostile takeover draped in the language of hate, engineered with the ruthlessness of industry. Behind her, Marcus crouched low, watching her read the map with narrowed eyes. "What is it?" "It's a ledger," she said grimly. "A hit list." He leaned closer, scanning the layout. "These are farm deeds, county records. How the hell did they even get this?" Naomi stood, tucking the map into her coat. Someone gave it to them. Someone with access. Someone who wants this land badly enough to turn racism into a strategy. Sirens echoed faintly through the distance, but Naomi didn't flinch. They were late. They were always late. Sheriff Briggs arrived in a cloud of dust, his cruiser pulling up fast beside the post office steps. The driver's door creaked open, and Briggs stepped out, brushing dust from his uniform with the slow, practiced gestures of a man who liked to appear composed, even when everything around him had been burning. He took off his sunglasses and looked around at the scene. Burned-out trucks, spent shell casings, blood on the sidewalk, and then locked eyes with Naomi. "Looks like you've been busy," he said flatly. Naomi didn't speak. She waited. He took a step forward, glancing at the people regrouping near the barricades. "Any word on who they were? Militants? Drug runners? Out-of-towners looking to stir up a mess?" "You know who they were," Naomi replied, her voice sharp but quiet. Briggs raised a brow. "Enlighten me." Naomi pulled the map from her coat, unfolded it, and handed it to him. She watched his face shift as he scanned the markings, the twitch in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. He didn't ask where she found it. He didn't ask what it meant. He already knew, but he folded it slowly, tucked it under his arm, and gave a small, dry smile. "I'll take this to the state office. See if we can get someone to take a closer look." Naomi stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not walking off with that. It's evidence," he replied. "No," she said firmly. "It's leverage, and it stays with me." Briggs held her gaze for a long time. Then, with a breath too slow to be casual, he handed the map back. "You're making this a lot harder than it has to be." Naomi stared at him with the clarity of someone who no longer cared about illusions. "Good." Briggs didn't linger. He got back into his car, shut the door, and drove away without a word. But Naomi wasn't done with him. That evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the burned-out silo and the makeshift triage center was winding down, Naomi stepped behind the corner of the church, where she'd heard movement. Soft and hurried. The light from the rear windows spilled faintly onto the dirt lot, just enough to catch the silhouette of Briggs pacing with a phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight and urgent. "I told you," he said, pacing hard. "It's not working. She's not scared. She's hunting us." A pause followed, then the sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots. "No, I don't think she knows yet. But if she gets to the top of this thing, if she finds out who signed off on the pipeline route, we're screwed." Naomi stepped back into the shadows before he turned. She didn't need to hear the rest. Not tonight. She returned to the barn with the map and laid it across the table once more. Isaiah stood beside her, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. "We're not just fighting a gang, are we?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied. "We're fighting a machine that uses men like that gang to clear the path. And Briggs, he's not the engine," she said, her voice steady. "He's just grease." Outside, the sky darkened again. The town stood in its own silence, caught between breaths. But Naomi had already moved past fear. She was done defending. Now it was time to dig deeper and strike back. The days that followed the assault were filled with more than cleanup. They were laced with a silence so heavy, so thick with tension, that even the wind seemed to tread lightly over the scorched fields and broken fence lines. Naomi didn't rest, not even for a moment, because she knew the fight hadn't ended. It had only pulled back to gather its weight for something worse. The lull was the kind that came before a storm, and her instincts had never betrayed her. She rotated the watch every 4 hours, rerouted the fallback positions, and walked the perimeter herself 3 times a day. Maggie stayed busy at the barn, stitching flesh and splinting bones with a determination that masked the sorrow in her eyes. Marcus split his time between the church and the grain tower, drilling new recruits and repairing radio signal boosters from salvaged equipment. Everyone was rebuilding, recalibrating, but Naomi could feel it in her gut, the kind of unspoken shift that had kept her alive in enemy territory more times than she could count. Isaiah, as always, had been her shadow, early to rise, precise with his movement, thoughtful in ways most boys his age never had to be. But that morning, his boots remained untouched by the door. The cot in the corner of the barn still bore the perfect indent of a body that hadn't stirred. His pack was missing, but the water canteen she had drilled him to carry religiously was left on the porch, condensation still trailing down the metal like a breath that had barely cooled. She didn't panic, not right away. She checked the perimeter logs, tapping through the readings on the slim tablet clipped to her belt, her eyes scanning for fluctuations in the sensors. The northern fence line had been silent since midnight. The eastern edge, however, showed a brief anomaly. One spike, no follow-up. A blip in the thermal reading near the shed, there and gone before the second sweep had time to confirm it. It could have been an animal. It could have been a trick of wind. But Naomi had learned long ago that war rarely knocked twice before it entered. By late morning, she had spoken to every member of the network. Marcus believed Isaiah had gone to fix the tower relay near the silo. Maggie thought he had mentioned checking on Clarence. Neither location held answers, only more silence. Clarence hadn't seen him. No one had. Naomi returned to the barn slowly, each step deliberate, her breath steady but growing heavier in her chest. The stillness in her bones was the kind that only came when every fiber in her body understood that something had shifted, and no amount of rational explanation could pull it back. Inside, she crossed the barn floor and moved straight to Isaiah's desk, the same place he kept his sketches, field notes, and checklist of daily assignments. The notebook was gone, which wouldn't have alarmed her, until she noticed the torn pages scattered across the floor. They weren't dropped. They were left behind in haste, pages ripped from the spine mid-thought, one of them torn diagonally as if pulled free while still being written on. Then she saw it. Half hidden beneath the table leg, nestled in the straw and dust, was a single brass casing, distinct, polished, stamped with symbols unfamiliar to any American manufacturer she'd seen. It was a foreign-made tracer round, not the kind they trained with, not the kind kept on this farm. She picked it up slowly, her fingers curling around the cold metal. She stared at it for a long moment before closing her hand, rising, and walking out into the sun without a word. The operation launched within the hour. Every watch point doubled its scan. Every back road was monitored. Naomi rode fast to the grain tower where Marcus was already cross-checking heat readings from the past 6 hours. One by one, they tracked every disturbance in the perimeter. Then she saw it. Tire marks curving east through the slope beyond the quarry. A faint track like someone had used a scrubbed vehicle with low tread pressure and a controlled exit. "I think he's been taken," she said flatly, her eyes still locked on the screen. Marcus looked up. "You think they breached us again?" "No," she replied quietly. "I think they baited him. Someone lured him out." Marcus's brow furrowed. "How?" "There was a girl," Naomi said, her voice distant but precise. "A volunteer. Young, friendly, temporary badge. I saw her at the church during the supply drop 2 days ago. She spoke to him. Just a moment. She was too smooth, too familiar." "What was her name?" "Kara." Marcus paused, eyes narrowing slightly. "Briggs has a daughter by that name. Used to live out of state. Got into some trouble. He doesn't talk about her." Naomi didn't answer. She didn't have to. She drove to the sheriff's office alone, arriving in a cloud of grit that settled over the steps and clung to her boots as she marched inside. Briggs was behind his desk when she entered, his phone slipping off the receiver with the clatter of someone caught mid-conversation. "My son is missing," Naomi said, her voice calm, devoid of emotion, but cut from steel. "I need to file a report." Briggs frowned, standing slowly. "What happened?" "He didn't report back last night. His gear's gone. His field pack, too. But his water bottle's still at the porch. I found a tracer round under his desk." "You think this is connected to the last hit?" he asked, his voice careful, too neutral to be blind. Naomi didn't blink. "I think it was deliberate, coordinated." Briggs picked up a form and slid it across his desk. "We'll file it. I'll notify the county watch." She filled out the form standing up, her pen firm in her hand, her eyes locked on his face. When she reached the line marked "Last Seen With," she wrote the name Kara in neat, steady block letters. Briggs didn't react, not visibly. But his throat worked once, his jaw tightened. And he didn't ask who Kara was. That was confirmation enough. Back at the barn, Naomi returned to the scanner logs and traced the thermal disturbance near the shed, enlarging the feed. The spike was unmistakable now. A pair of heat signatures, one smaller than the other, one upright, the other dragging. She compared it to the camera stationed near the far road. A black SUV, late model, dark windows, driven by a woman. She couldn't see the face, but the posture was unmistakable. Kara Briggs, the daughter of the man who had just sworn to help her find her son. Naomi said nothing. She packed light. She moved faster. The trail led east into the hills near the old mining grounds. There, nestled into the slope of a granite ridge, hidden by overgrowth and decades of disuse, was a compound made from reinforced metal and rusted fencing. She slipped in silent and struck hard. 2 guards neutralized, 4 cameras disabled, the access gate bypassed with a homemade charge. She didn't find Isaiah, but what she found made her stop cold. A makeshift prison had been carved into the ground beneath the compound, reinforced cages lining both sides of a narrow hallway. Inside them, 12 black men and women, some barefoot, some bruised, all stripped of dignity. Their eyes tracked her as if afraid she was another mirage. She stepped forward, keyring in hand, and one of them clutched a sheaf of papers, thrusting it into her palm with trembling fingers. Land deeds, dozens of them, each signed under duress, each name familiar. They had been stolen, not just taken, but erased. Naomi freed them one by one, guiding them up the slope where Marcus waited with a convoy of silent, grim-faced volunteers. No one asked what came next. Because Naomi didn't return to Ridge Hollow that night, she disappeared without a word, and from that moment on, the war was no longer defensive. It was personal. She crossed into the hills alone, taking only what she could carry, and for days there was no sound of her voice over the comms, no return to the barn, no flash of her face on the drone feeds they swept over the region. She became a whisper again, the kind of quiet that hunted, while the others rebuilt the safe zones and guarded the families rescued from beneath that compound. Naomi moved deeper into the wilderness with one goal left burning in her chest: eliminate the root, cut off the head of the network. Not just the soldiers, not just the gang, the architects, the ones who signed papers behind boardroom glass while pretending their hands were clean. And in order to reach them, she would have to disappear completely. So she did. The old hunting shack was perfect. A one-room structure she and her husband had once used during winter drills, forgotten by the county and hidden in the folds of a dried-up ravine. She stocked it with decoys, munitions, a satellite radio wired to broadcast static, and rigged the floor with a pressure-triggered thermite charge masked beneath layers of dust and age. Then, knowing exactly how these men tracked ghosts, she let herself be seen, just once, crossing the southern ridge, with her rifle strapped low, limping slightly, a smear of blood down one arm. She gave them a silhouette, and then vanished again. By the time they closed in on the shack, believing it to be her fallback post, the charge was already armed. The blast ripped through the ravine in a thunderous roar that carried smoke for half a mile, tearing the roof from the cabin and throwing debris high into the trees. When their cleanup crew arrived, all they found were charred bones, fragments of Naomi's field gear, bloodied cloth sealed in ash, and enough heat residue to confirm a death without a body. The gang relaxed. They lowered their security sweeps. The patrols softened. The chatter shifted again. Naomi Cross, the ghost of Ridge Hollow, had been eliminated. They were wrong. While they whispered stories of their victory, and returned to their fortified schedules, Isaiah was already gone. He had escaped 3 nights before the explosion, crawling through a drainage pipe beneath the second compound, a narrow, rusted artery of stone and rotted steel that had once served as overflow for mining runoff. He had watched his captors long enough to learn their patterns, counting steps and smoke breaks and the number of seconds it took the camera outside the bunkhouse to rotate. He hadn't waited for rescue because he had been taught not to. His mother hadn't raised him to hope someone would come. She had raised him to be the one who moved when the door cracked open, who remembered every escape path, who never forgot the roots carved into his muscles during sleepless nights on the training field. He stole a key card. He slipped a knife from a distracted guard's belt. He ran. And for days, he ran without aim. Only direction, east, toward the ravines she'd shown him when he was still too young to hold a rifle, but old enough to read the stars. He had nearly collapsed on the 4th night. Exhaustion wrapped around him like a fog, his breath coming in bursts as he leaned against a low ash tree trying to remember which ridge led to the blind cave. And then he saw it, the netting. Draped between 2 boulders, half covered in moss, was a thermal shield Naomi had once shown him how to build. No one else would have known it was there. Not even Marcus. He slipped beneath the canvas and fell forward into the arms of the one person he had never stopped believing in. Naomi didn't speak as he collapsed against her. She only caught him, held him, ran her hands over his back and sides to check for wounds, then wrapped him in the blanket she'd already laid out. She had felt him coming. Somehow, she had always known. That night, while Isaiah slept with his face against her shoulder and his fists still clenched in defense even in rest, Naomi unrolled the folder she had pulled from the last raid. The courier's bag ripped open and stripped of its papers, each document examined until she found what she was looking for. In the lower right corner of a grant funding outline was a familiar logo. Clean, minimal. 3 interlocking arrows surrounding a tree. Forward Futures, a nonprofit, they called it. An agricultural equity initiative designed to revitalize underdeveloped rural communities through strategic stewardship. But the documents told another story. They weren't purchasing land. They were claiming it. Backed by shadow corporations, international funding, and legal protections stacked so high that even a federal audit would take years to penetrate. And the name at the center, the one signing the authorizations and funneling grant money into shell corporations wrapped in green slogans and hollow mission statements, was a name Naomi had seen only once before, across the table from a military contractor during a black site debrief. Dr. Eva Carr, an analyst turned strategist, a clean public image, white gloves and delicate diction. She had never held a rifle, but she had ordered the men who did. And now she was the silent mind behind the entire operation, building a privatized network of farmland clearance disguised as redevelopment. Her compound, listed as a research facility, was nestled 20 miles east of Ridge Hollow, shielded by corporate timberland, protected by mercenaries wearing non-profit logos stitched to their vests like something benevolent. Naomi folded the papers in the low firelight and tucked them back into the waterproof pouch beneath her coat. It wasn't enough to stop the gang. She would have to end its heart, and Eva Carr was its pulse. The storm rolled in quietly over the ridge, low clouds stretching long and flat across the timberline, diffusing the moonlight into a cold, silver haze that wrapped the world in shadows. Naomi moved beneath it, like she belonged to the dark. Her steps measured, her gear silent, her breath steady enough to disappear into the rhythm of the wind. Isaiah remained behind, hidden with Marcus and the newly fortified group in the southern ravine, unaware of where she was going or how far she intended to go. She had told no one what she planned. This wasn't a team mission. It wasn't a siege. It was a reckoning. The compound that housed Forward Future's so-called research operations, stood like a scar across the tree line. 3 low-slung buildings of modern steel and glass, nestled between artificial berms and lined with a security fence that disguised itself with climbing ivy and motion-triggered floodlights. To the outside eye, it looked like a reforestation lab, the kind of place that grew seedlings and hosted interns with grant money and idealistic slogans. But Naomi had seen the blueprints, and she knew how to read between lines meant to deceive. Behind that glass was a military-grade fortress. Every corner of the structure had been reinforced. Every exit was either guarded or alarmed. This was not a research site. It was a command center. She entered from beneath. A drainage culvert extended from the southern slope, half buried in rock and barely wide enough to crawl through, but it gave her an access point outside the motion sensor's primary radius. She had to shimmy for 20 yards, her elbows bruising against rusted pipe and grit, before she reached the concrete junction that dropped into the substation. Once inside, she stilled for a full minute, waiting, breathing, becoming part of the dark. Then she moved. 2 guards passed within feet of her without so much as a pause, their radios murmuring soft chatter. Words like reallocation and compliance zones, bureaucratic code, draped over violence. Naomi slipped through a side door into the east wing, avoiding cameras by memory, counting her steps until she reached the internal data center. The room smelled sterile, like plastic and chilled air, humming with machines that blinked in lazy patterns of green and blue. Naomi knew she had minutes at best. She didn't sit. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the flash drive from beneath her collar, plugged it into the primary terminal, and began the extraction. The screen filled instantly. Dozens of folders populated with date codes and acronyms. She opened the first one. Images appeared. Aerial surveillance of black-owned farms. Names, parcel numbers, GPS overlays with red lines scrawled over homes and barns. Another folder showed scanned signatures, power of attorney transfers, land deeds signed under duress, notarized by the same 3 names, all employees of Forward Futures. She kept downloading. One folder was labeled Sable Project, Oversight Briefings. She opened it. Inside was a transcript. Dry, clinical. Phase 2 scheduled following destabilization efforts. Resistance predicted. Targeted pressure may require removal of entrenched leadership. Suggested candidates for neutralization: N cross, M bell, I cross. Naomi didn't blink. She opened the attached photos. There she was, captured in black and white, exiting her barn weeks earlier, unaware a drone had caught the entire moment from half a mile above. Another image showed Marcus leaving the church. A third, Isaiah, carrying a water pail, caught in profile near the north fence. She moved faster now. A door clicked down the hall. She unplugged the drive and slipped it into the lining of her glove just as the lights dimmed for power rerouting. The hum of footsteps crept closer. Naomi stepped behind a service cabinet and stilled her breath until the guard passed. She exited back through the utility wing and slipped into the adjacent corridor, one lined with offices and framed credentials. And that's where she saw it. A glass door etched with the name Dr. Eva Carr, Executive Director. The office beyond was quiet, softly lit, decorated with potted plants and photographs that looked hand-picked to seem unthreatening. Eva smiling at a ribbon cutting, Eva shaking hands with a state senator, Eva surrounded by school children holding saplings. But Naomi moved straight to the back wall, where a filing cabinet had been left half open. Her fingers found the marked folders and flipped until a name stopped her cold. Commander Aaron Cross, status, KIA. She pulled the folder. Inside were pages marked Classified, Defense Consulting Review. The seal belonged to a contractor Naomi had worked with once overseas. It detailed a drone strike, coded as collateral damage, targeted in Kandahar province, meant to eliminate a high-value insurgent, but the coordinates had shifted mid-flight. The drone had struck too early, too low. Civilian casualties, no accountability. The mission lead was listed clearly. Car, Ava, clearance Tier 4. Oversight confirmed. Naomi stared at the words as the weight behind them settled in her chest. This was the woman who had killed her husband, and erased it with a keystroke. And now, Naomi knew. The fire in her lungs didn't burn with rage. It burned with clarity. She slipped the folder into her satchel and turned toward the exit, her steps as silent as the breath she no longer allowed herself to release. The war hadn't changed, but the target had. Naomi closed the folder with a controlled motion, pressing her gloved fingertips to the edge of the paper before sliding it deep into the base of her satchel, anchoring it beneath the flash drive she had extracted from the data center and the small, dense pouch that contained 2 charges she had packed, not out of habit, but with a very specific outcome in mind. There was no tremble in her hands, no hesitation in her breath, only a quiet sharpening of her focus, the kind that came from clarity earned through loss. She had long suspected that Aaron's death had not been as surgical as the official report claimed, had buried her doubts beneath layers of discipline and duty, refusing to let grief compromise mission readiness. But now, with Ava Carr's name printed clean across the declassified file in her possession, there was no ambiguity left. The war Naomi had been fighting to protect her home had just merged with the war she had tried for years to forget. There was no alarm yet, only the quiet buzz of power flowing through walls that hummed with expensive insulation and the faint clicking of climate control systems working to keep the building silent and sterile. Naomi turned from the office with precise steps, her eyes adjusting to the corridor beyond, her boots finding purchase on polished floors that reflected none of the violence about to unfold. She had mapped her exit in advance, memorized it the way she would memorize an enemy's weapons loadout, and she moved with the kind of silent confidence that made her disappear before anyone realized she had passed. But by the time she rounded the corner toward the auxiliary stairwell, she heard the change. The clipped rhythm of guards' boots striking tile with too much urgency to be routine, and the low murmur of radio chatter turning tight and rapid, as if someone had noticed a door left ajar, or a drawer left rifled through. She kept moving, faster now, but without panic. Her body coiled like a wire drawn to the breaking point. Her hand reached into her coat, fingers curling around the cold weight of a flash charge, which she cracked against her palm and tossed gently over her shoulder as she ducked into the next hall. The detonation was lightless, a burst of noise and shock designed not to wound, but to confuse. And as the concussion echoed through the corridor, Naomi dropped to one knee, turned, and fired 2 rounds from her suppressed sidearm, each one precise, each one landing with surgical intent. The first tore through the shoulder of a guard reaching for his rifle, knocking him back into the wall, while the second cut across the thigh of the man next to him, dropping him to the ground with a cry choked off mid-sound. She didn't stop to watch them fall. She moved again, cutting down a side passage and slipping through the stairwell door just as it opened from the other side. The man who stepped through had no time to react. Naomi drove her shoulder into his center mass, using his momentum to lift him off the ground and slam him against the railing. As he gasped for air, she swept his legs with a tight arc of her knee, letting his body crumple before delivering a controlled blow to the back of his head that ended the encounter in silence. His partner, who came through the doorway just a beat too late, raised his weapon in a panic, but Naomi moved first, striking the barrel upward, disarming him in one fluid motion, and bringing the edge of her elbow across his temple hard enough to drop him without a second breath. She descended the stairwell in long strides, landing at the sub-level corridor as the compound security system finally shifted. The lights above her changed from steady white to pulsing amber, and a thin alarm began to pulse, a distant, mechanical tone that wasn't quite panic yet, but was gathering strength with each cycle. They didn't know where she was, but they knew someone was here. She calculated how long that uncertainty would last. Less than a minute. She sprinted across the sublevel, reaching the culvert gate just as the facility's lockdown sequence began to close the outer exits. The gate dropped fast, but Naomi dropped faster, sliding beneath the steel frame just as it slammed into place behind her. Cutting off the corridor in a burst of reinforced metal and sparking dust, the shock reverberated through her bones. But she didn't stop. She crawled through the culvert, her hands clawing forward, her shoulders brushing the narrow walls of the tunnel, each foot dragging grit and steel shavings as she pushed toward the tree line beyond. When the first bullet struck the tunnel's exterior with a ringing snap, she knew they had reached the outer cameras. She didn't turn. Instead, she reached back, pulled the second charge from her satchel, snapped the primer, and dropped it into the crawl space behind her. The explosion hit like a breathless roar, concussing the steel and concrete and turning the narrow tunnel into a furnace of smoke and earth. Naomi was flung forward, hitting the edge of the drainage outlet with a force that bruised ribs and tore the seam of her shoulder. But she rolled quickly and vanished into the trees before the fire even settled. The forest closed behind her like a secret. She did not look back. Branches clawed at her arms, dirt filled her lungs, and her limbs burned from the effort. But she moved with the focus of a woman who had trained for this her entire life. She ran until the lights disappeared and the sounds of pursuit died behind her. She didn't slow until the world narrowed into silence again, and the compound sat buried behind a wall of forest and stone. Only then, when the night had swallowed the last trace of her passage, did she drop to her knees behind the roots of a fallen pine and pull the satchel open with shaking hands. The folder was intact, the flash drive still dry, still sealed. She had everything, every file, every signature, every photo and transcript, every classified directive that linked forward futures to the displacement of black families, to the laundering of military development funds, to the targeted intimidation campaigns that were never meant to reach the public eye. But more than that, she had the one truth that changed the shape of every battle she had fought since this began. Eva Carr, who had built this operation with polished smiles and non-profit slogans, was the same woman who had authorized the drone strike that killed Aaron in Kandahar, the same woman who had sat in a control booth and called it collateral, the same woman who had signed his death with a clearance code and erased it with a keyword. This wasn't revenge. It was justice, sharpened to a blade. And Naomi would deliver it the only way she knew how, not as a widow, not even as a soldier, but as a storm. Naomi returned to Ridge Hollow before dawn, slipping back into town the same way she had left, unseen, unannounced, and moving with the quiet purpose of someone who no longer needed to explain herself. Her presence, however, did not go unnoticed for long. Word spread faster than fire in dry timber. She had returned alive. She had evidence, and this time, she wasn't just coming back to fight. She was coming back to finish. The first thing she did was call Marcus, not through encrypted channels or quiet relays, but on a public signal, using a line she knew would be intercepted. She wanted them to hear her voice again, wanted the handlers behind the towers and terminals to feel the weight of what they had failed to destroy. Then she called the press. Not the national outlets, not the polished networks with anchors who wore sincerity like stage makeup. She called the regional crews, the ones who still traveled in battered vans with heavy tripods and cracked lenses, the ones who had been turned away from the last town hall, who knew what it meant to record injustice when no one else was looking. By noon, the first satellite trucks arrived, parking crooked along the church lawn and along the gravel lot outside the grain tower. They set up beneath the same banners that had once marked harvest festivals and summer potlucks. But the faces in the crowd weren't smiling. They were tired, bruised, watching. Naomi didn't speak first. She let the survivors speak. Maggie stood before the cameras, her voice clear, her hands steady as she unfolded one of the land deeds Naomi had recovered. She read the name aloud. James Elder, 68. Ridge Hollow, born and raised. Forced to sign over his family's soil at gunpoint, while his barn burned behind him. Then she read the second. Lucille Jones, 74, found locked in a cage beneath Eva Carr's compound, her wrists still raw from the shackles that had held her. One by one, the survivors came forward. They did not weep. They did not shout. They simply testified, their words like steady blows against a wall too long left standing. Then Naomi stepped forward. She wore no uniform, no insignia, just a black jacket zipped to the collar, and a voice honed by war and purpose. She held up the flash drive and read the names behind the orders. Carr, Sable Initiative, Forward Futures, the shell companies that had funneled contracts through silence. She named dates, listed locations, described not just the land theft but the design behind it, the racial targeting, the displacement framed as revitalization, the drone surveillance, the signature confirming the order that killed her husband in a strike that had never made the news. "This isn't a fight for soil," she said. "This is a fight for the right to exist without permission." The crowd stirred. Cameras whirred. Reporters leaned closer, some nodding, some blinking like they were trying to process something too large for words. The town did not erupt. It cracked. Some stood with her, veterans, teachers, survivors of the raids who had been too afraid to speak until now. They formed ranks behind her, not shouting, not chanting, just standing shoulder to shoulder in silent defiance. Others lingered at the edge, their arms crossed, their mouths tight. Not everyone wanted war exposed in daylight. Not everyone could bear what the truth demanded, and still others turned away entirely. At the diner near the crossroads, windows were shuttered. The old feed store that had once donated supplies to Marcus's church pulled their sponsorship banners. Murmurs drifted through the town like poison about Naomi bringing the trouble back, about outsiders poking wounds that should have been left to scar. But Naomi didn't wait for consensus. She organized the march. She met with the elders, the pastors, the families who had nearly been erased, and together they laid the path straight to the county courthouse, the same building where so many land deeds had quietly changed hands, where Eva Carr's agents had hidden behind legality and red tape. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't request a permit. She called it what it was, a stand. The date was set for Friday at noon. And across the valley, just beyond the radio tower near the old freight station, Clayton Ward listened to the broadcast with a face carved from hatred. His men had been scattered, his lines cut, his power reduced to memory. But the core remained, the loyal, the angry, the men who didn't need money to kill, only a cause twisted deep enough to call home. "This town's weak now," he said, spitting into the dirt as he watched the grainy drone feed on the screen before him. "They're marching into the open. That's when we take it all back." He gathered what remained of his crew, not polished soldiers but broken men, hardened by loss and sharpened by blame. They loaded weapons into the back of stolen trucks, marked routes along dirt roads the county no longer paved, and whispered to each other not of victory, but of vengeance. Because for them, this was never about land. It was about erasure. And now, backed into a corner with their name on every headline and their secrets exposed to the world, they weren't retreating. They were coming for blood. The night before the march began like any other in Ridge Hollow. Quiet, cool, wrapped in the stillness that only came when a town had emptied itself of secrets and was waiting for the consequences. The sun fell behind the tree line in slow, deliberate strokes, painting the fields in copper and rust, until only shadows remained. Porch lights flickered on. Windows latched. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then went silent. No one slept. Not really. Naomi stood on the grain tower roof, her rifle slung across her back, eyes scanning the valley in slow, patient sweeps. She had expected them to strike before the march. There had been too much exposure, too many headlines naming names, too many networks carrying the truth Eva Carr had spent a decade burying. The only thing left for men like Clayton Ward was retaliation, rage wrapped in desperation. And that kind of fury didn't wait for sunrise. She climbed down from the tower with the kind of grace that came from muscle memory, sharpened by purpose, then walked the perimeter one final time, checking traps, adjusting line-of-sight markers, confirming signals with the watchers stationed in the school's old bell tower and the silo-turned communications hub. Every quadrant had been fortified. Every civilian willing to fight had been trained. Not in fantasy, not in bravado, but in practical, efficient defense. Naomi hadn't taught them how to win. She had taught them how to survive and make sure their enemies didn't. Marcus waited by the south fence, adjusting the night vision rig he'd built from salvaged parts and duct-taped brackets. He didn't speak when she approached, just nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything had been done, and there was nothing left but the wait. They didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, the ridgeline flared. Not with headlights, not with engines, but with movement. 30, maybe 40 shadows slipping down the slope in disciplined clusters, spreading through the fields with practiced intent. They moved like men who had once trained for urban war and now carried that bitterness into the back roads. But they didn't know what Ridge Hollow had become. They didn't know Naomi had laid this trap weeks ago. The first charge detonated when their lead scout crossed the orchard path, a tripline sewn into the tall grass snapping taut beneath his knee. The explosion wasn't lethal, but it blinded. And as the second wave stumbled back in confusion, Naomi's people opened fire from the flank, not in chaos, not with fear, but in coordination. Isaiah led one of the fallback units, his voice calm over the comms, directing civilians into cover, keeping the youngest recruits paired with veterans. His eyes burned with focus, his movements fluid, precise. Everything Naomi had taught him rising now in full. The attackers pushed forward anyway. They moved through the southern fields and into the western edge of town, using cover, advancing with pressure. But Naomi had mined the alleyway behind the diner, had reinforced the church wall with steel core barriers hidden behind plywood, had rigged the school bus parked near the crossroads to release a smoke screen that split the field of fire and funneled the gang right into the open. The firefight that followed was brutal, sharp, tactical. No one shouted. There was no screaming, just the steady rhythm of war, the thump of boots on earth, the rattle of rounds, the short, grim gasps of men realizing they were outmatched by a community they thought would crumble. Naomi moved through the chaos like a fixed star, directing flanks, reinforcing positions, pulling wounded back without pause. She struck with purpose, dropped targets with efficiency, and never once left Isaiah's voice out of range. But the gang wasn't fighting to win. They were fighting to destroy. Clayton Ward moved with them like a specter, ducking through the firefight, issuing orders with the savage ease of someone who had built his identity on hate. He wasn't here for strategy. He was here to finish what he believed Naomi had started, to burn the last of Ridge Hollow into the ground. And at his side, though hidden in shadows, was Kara Briggs. She moved through the chaos with speed and certainty, her face a mask of cold resolve, her weapon aimed not at buildings or structures, but at the heart of the resistance. She was targeting leadership. Maggie, Marcus, Naomi. A precision strike cloaked in personal vengeance, but someone had followed her. Sheriff Briggs had been watching since the March announcement. He had read Naomi's file, had heard the whispers, had pieced together just enough to understand the role his daughter had played in the kidnappings, in the cover-ups, in the blood on the dirt. And now, as she raised her rifle toward Maggie's station near the church bell, he stepped into her path. The shot meant for Maggie struck Briggs instead. It caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground with a force that ripped the air from his lungs. Kara froze, not because she missed, but because she recognized him, standing there in full view, wearing the badge he no longer deserved, but refusing to let his daughter take another life. Naomi saw the moment from across the field, caught the tremble in Kara's hands, the split second of hesitation. She moved fast, crossed the church lot, circled behind the grain truck, and intercepted the path before Kara could recover. The takedown was fast and merciless. A strike to the wrist, a twist that disarmed, and a clean blow to the temple that dropped the girl hard into the mud. Kara's weapon skittered away. Naomi pressed a boot to her back and held her there until Marcus arrived with a pair of reinforced cuffs. "She's done," Naomi said, her voice low. "She's his," Marcus replied. Sheriff Briggs, still clutching his shoulder, nodded weakly as the medics pulled him behind cover. He didn't look at Naomi. He didn't have to. Whatever blame remained between them had already been burned away by the bullet that now pulsed inside his flesh. The town held. The line held. And as the last of Clayton's men retreated into the woods, broken, scattered, leaderless, the dawn began to creep over the ridge with the slow, golden weight of something earned. Smoke hung in the streets like the last breath of a nightmare, curling through the shattered windows of the church and drifting past the scorched iron fences that had once marked Ridge Hollow's quiet resilience. The town was no longer silent, but the noise had changed. No longer panic or chaos, but the steady murmur of survivors accounting for one another, hands gripping shoulders, voices calling names, bodies moving together through the slow, sacred ritual of taking back what they had nearly lost. Naomi moved through it without pause. There was no celebration in her eyes, no relief. The victory, if it could be called that, had already been weighed and measured. Her steps cut a direct path through the square and past the courthouse steps, where the flag hung half-torn and blackened by ash, snapping in the wind like a reminder of how close they had come to being erased. She didn't look up right away. She didn't have to. She already knew where he would be, the one thread still unraveling, the final echo of a war that had hollowed itself down to a single man, and the twisted pride that refused to die with him. And so, as the town braced for recovery, Naomi climbed the courthouse staircase alone, boots quiet on scorched stone, her breath steady and unbroken. She passed the courtroom doors, now hanging crooked on broken hinges, past the hallway where the land deeds had once been signed under threat and silence, and made her way to the narrow stairwell that spiraled upward like a final trial carved into brick. At the top, the air turned colder. The rooftop was silent, but not still. The wind curled low across the stone, sweeping through shards of glass and torn flags that fluttered against bent rails. And there, crouched behind a concrete ledge with a long-range scope still warm beneath his hands, was Clayton Ward. He didn't turn at first. He didn't need to. "I figured you'd come," he said, his voice carrying just enough bitterness to slice through the cold. "You couldn't help yourself." Naomi stepped forward, her rifle slung and forgotten across her back. "Neither could you." Clayton finally turned, rising slowly from his crouch, the barrel of his sniper rifle tilted just slightly toward her chest. He didn't aim. Not yet. He wanted the moment, wanted the control. "You think this is over?" he asked, his lips curling into something that might have been a grin if it hadn't been carved from exhaustion. "You think marching a few reporters through a burned-out town changes what people believe? You think people like me disappear just because you shouted louder?" Naomi didn't flinch. "People like you never disappear. You hide. You adapt. And when the world stops looking, You come back with new names and old hate." He raised the barrel another inch. "So what now? You shoot me on a rooftop while the cameras roll? Make me your warning?" She took another step closer, her voice quiet, steady. "You lost the moment you saw us as prey." The words struck like a slow-burning fuse, and he reacted, not with rage, not with confusion, but with a measured, ruthless lunge that came from muscle memory and battlefield instinct. The rifle snapped up, but Naomi had already read the movement in his stance, already seen the shift in his shoulders, the tension in his left hand. She pivoted to the side just as he pulled the trigger. The shot cracked over the rooftop, tearing into the air with a sonic whip, missing her head by inches. She was already moving. Her hand caught the barrel, driving it upward again, then twisting, breaking his grip. The weapon clattered to the rooftop and skidded over the edge. Clayton surged forward, tackling her against the base of the courthouse dome, his weight slamming into her ribs, his knee pressing for control. But Naomi had been in worse holds, under worse skies, against stronger men. She rotated into the strike, twisted her hips beneath his grip, and rolled him hard onto his back with a fluid snap that drove the breath from his lungs. He came up swinging, sloppy now, fueled by adrenaline and pain, but she sidestepped, landed a brutal strike to his temple, then another to the side of his jaw that cracked louder than the wind. Blood flew from his mouth as he staggered backward. He wiped it with the back of his hand and grinned through his split lip. "You think you're better than me?" he spat. "You used people to fight your battles. You hid behind their grief." Naomi's voice stayed low, steady. "No, I trained them to fight, because I believed they were worth protecting. And they stood, because they knew what they were defending. You were always just attacking shadows." Clayton roared, lunging again, but this time his footing faltered on the blood-slick stone beneath him, and Naomi caught him mid-stride, drove her elbow into his chest, and dropped him with a leg sweep so precise it folded him to the ground like dead weight. "You were always just attacking shadows." Clayton roared, lunging again, but this time his footing faltered on the blood-slick stone beneath him, and Naomi caught him mid-stride, drove her elbow into his chest, and dropped him with a leg sweep so precise it folded him to the ground like dead weight. Before he could rise, she mounted him, pinned his arm, and with one brutal, final motion, dislocated his shoulder and pressed his face into the cold stone with the heel of her hand. Clayton gasped, his limbs twitching beneath her weight, his chest rising with fury that no longer had anywhere to go. His body had been broken. His name, his network, his entire cause, dismantled by the very people he thought too weak, too disorganized, too frightened to matter. Naomi didn't kill him. She didn't need to. She leaned close, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want them to see you," she said. "See what's left of all that hate when it has nothing left to feed on." He didn't respond. Couldn't. Blood pooled at the corner of his mouth. His limbs trembled beneath her, not from fear, but from the slow realization that it was over. And he had lost, not in glory, not in sacrifice, but in silence, in defeat, in exposure. Naomi rose without a word, turning from the wreckage of the man who had terrorized her town, scarred her people, tried to erase her family's name from the earth. She didn't look back as Marcus climbed the stairs with a medic in tow, didn't pause as Isaiah approached from the far ledge, rifle lowered but ready. The rooftop didn't echo with cheers or cries. It echoed with the soft, heavy truth of an end. And Naomi walked away from it, not in triumph, not with fanfare, but with the gravity of someone who understood that the war was never just about bullets or bodies. It was about who stayed standing when the smoke cleared. It was about what they chose to build after the fire, and whether the silence that followed would be one of peace or of erasure. She descended the courthouse steps just as the morning sun broke fully over Ridge Hollow, the light warm against her shoulders, the sky clear in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Around her, the townspeople moved slowly, tending to the wounded, retrieving supplies, gathering in quiet circles not to grieve, but to begin. The worst had passed. The enemy had been beaten back. But the work ahead, Naomi knew, was just beginning. She gave no speech. She gave no orders. She handed the flash drive to a reporter who had refused to leave when the cameras went dark. The same woman who had slept in her van behind the church for 3 nights just to capture the truth the networks wouldn't touch until it became too loud to ignore. "I don't want a headline," Naomi said as she placed the drive into the woman's hand. "I want the truth." Within 24 hours, it was no longer just Ridge Hollow that was watching. The story spread like wildfire, not the edited, half-sanitized version that often diluted black pain into digestible bites, but the raw footage, the names, the land deeds, the video stills of families imprisoned underground, the voice recordings of Eva Carr authorizing payments to contractors and militia cells. Her voice clipped and calm as she discussed containment parameters and asset removal strategies, like they were nothing more than budgetary notes. The FBI moved faster than anyone expected. Arrest warrants were issued across 4 states. Raids swept through shell offices in Arkansas, Georgia, and Tennessee. Former military contractors, local officials, and land acquisition agents were brought into custody. Forward Futures was dissolved within a week. Its remaining assets were frozen. Its name erased from lobby directories and wiped from public websites, as if it had never existed. But Eva Carr did not vanish. She was arrested at a private airfield north of Nashville, found seated in the back of a black SUV, still wearing the clean blazer she had worn in every public appearance since her rise to influence. Her hands were cuffed without resistance. Her eyes never once met the agents surrounding her. She didn't need to ask why. She already knew who had done it. Her arraignment was broadcast live. Naomi sat in the gallery. She wore a black dress coat, her hair pulled back, her face unreadable. She did not flinch as the charges were read aloud. Domestic terrorism, conspiracy to commit targeted land seizure, fraudulent transfer of property, abuse of federal redevelopment funds, and accessory to unlawful detainment and torture. Each count landed like a cold bell in a silent church. Eva Carr never looked back toward the seats. Not once. She sat with her hands folded neatly on the defense table, eyes locked forward, still pretending that distance could save her. But Naomi was not there to watch her break. She was there to finish what had been started. When it came time to testify, Naomi stepped into the witness stand without hesitation. She was addressed as Ms. Cross, but her presence said more than a name. She didn't testify as a victim. She didn't describe herself as a survivor. She stood as a soldier, an American defending her homeland not in a foreign theater, but in the soil her family had worked for generations, in the fences her son had rebuilt, in the church her neighbors had defended with kitchen knives and courage. "I didn't go to war," she said. "War came to me." There was no applause, only stillness. A judge who stopped writing mid-sentence. A jury that did not blink. And across the country, screens flickered in living rooms and gas station diners and office lobbies, broadcasting the image of a woman who had refused to disappear, who had answered cruelty not with vengeance, but with precision. Eva Carr was found guilty on all counts. Her sentence was sealed and sent to federal records, but Naomi did not read the details. She had no interest in how many years the walls would hold her. Her interest was in what happened outside them, because Ridge Hollow had survived. And now, finally, it could begin to live. The fields were cleared in late spring. Marcus led a planting initiative through the town square, turning the burned-out lot behind the feed store into a community garden. Isaiah, taller now, steadier, helped build the new training outpost near the grain tower, where younger kids practiced perimeter drills in the afternoons, not because they feared another war, but because they had inherited the discipline, to protect what they loved. Maggie reopened the clinic. Sheriff Briggs resigned quietly. The weight of his choices carried not in words, but in the way he tended the church lawn every Sunday morning without fail. And Naomi? She rebuilt the farmhouse, slowly, deliberately, with her own hands. She never used contractors, never left the land. Every nail, every beam, every inch of it was laid with purpose. She planted herbs outside the kitchen window. She wired motion sensors into the barn. She kept a rifle in the study, locked in the same case her husband once carried across oceans. But more than anything, she stayed, because staying, in the end, was the revolution. The land breathed again. It was not immediate, not dramatic, and not without scars, but the air shifted all the same. The silence that had once carried threat now carried peace, fragile and flickering, but real. Ridge Hollow had not forgotten what it endured. The walls still bore bullet marks. The trees still leaned uneven, where flames had licked their trunks. The town didn't pretend nothing had happened, but it stood. And for the first time in a long time, it stood without fear. Justice had not come easy, and it had not come clean. There were still hearings underway in 3 counties, still slow-moving restitution claims caught in legal tangles, still gaps in records that would never be filled. But the machinery of silence that had once turned oppression into paperwork had finally been dismantled. Families returned to their homes. Deeds were restored. The cages beneath Forward Future's compound were sealed and torn down, every inch of them exposed to the public in photos, in court exhibits, in testimony given beneath oath and memory. And through it all, Naomi remained, not as a leader issuing orders, not as a symbol standing on stages, but as a constant presence, a quiet sentinel who had shown her people not just how to fight, but how to endure and how to begin again without surrendering what made them whole. She walked the perimeter every morning, the same path she had once used to check the fence line during the darkest weeks of siege. Now, the same route passed through replanted cornfields and gardens blooming behind the rebuilt church. Isaiah sometimes walked beside her, taller than he had been, more silent than before, but strong in ways that weren't just physical. He had been changed, yes, but not broken. They visited Aaron's grave on a morning with no wind, the sky still soft with mist that hadn't yet burned off the hills. Naomi stood with her son beside the stone marker, her fingers brushing the edge of the granite as if tracing the letters for the first time, though she knew them by heart. She said nothing for a long while. Neither did Isaiah. The air between them carried too much to name. Loss, yes, but also survival, and the quiet acknowledgement that everything they had built, everything they had saved, had come from a strength that no one outside their soil had ever been able to measure. "I kept my promise," she finally said, her voice low and even. "I brought him home." Isaiah nodded once, not needing to ask who she meant. They stood there a little longer, watching the sun rise over the fields Aaron had once dreamed of cultivating in peace, before turning back toward the farmhouse that now stood rebuilt, solid and waiting, its roof gleaming with new metal beneath the light. The land was safe, the community had endured, and Naomi Cross, once a name buried in covert missions and erased files, once the woman they thought could be pushed, broken, erased, had become something more. Not just a soldier, not just a mother, not even just a survivor. She had become a legend, the kind of legend whispered in the wake of fire, carried in the strength of rebuilt walls, etched into the silence of mornings that no longer feared what would come with the night. She did not ask to be remembered, but she would be, not because of how she fought, but because she stayed, because she refused to leave, because she made sure none of them ever had to again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.